You so much for that introduction, Marie Christine, and I am really honored to be here and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today on this important topic. And the title, again, of my presentation is Racially Conscious Trauma-Informed Care, a Healing Approach for Black, Indigenous, People of Color communities. Before I start, however, I would like to provide an acknowledgement. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the original people of this land. I speak to you today from my office, which is in Portland, and I want to recognize that it is now called Portland, but it's the original land of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wasco, Malala, and Cowlitz and Watlala bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes that made their homes along the Columbia River. So today, these bands have become part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, as well as the Chinook Nation and Cowlitz Nation in Washington State. So today we respect the elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We honor the tribes and people that have been impacted by practices of genocide and colonization. And what I just did, just in this moment, is to acknowledge the original people of the land. That's an important step in incorporating healing practices toward BIPOC communities, and in this instance, the native people of this land. I know folks are joining from all over, so it's always a nice thing before starting work to just kind of take a moment to consider the original peoples that stewarded the land that you are working from. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because in order for a problem to be solved, there must be acknowledgement and agreement on the fact that the problem exists. In this case, there must be acknowledgement and agreement that institutional, systemic, and structural racism is real and that systemic bias exists. And this is the first step in healing trauma. And so when we give an acknowledgement of original people, we are taking a first step in recognizing genocide and colonization. And so with any work with communities of color, you know, the one will get to this as we talk about practices. The number one thing is acknowledging that that is a real circumstance and that harm has been done. And so I wanted to start with that, but also to kind of expand it to the larger work that we'll be discussing as well today as psychologists. I'm going to actually, before I share my PowerPoint, I also wanted to briefly share a story. Those who know me know that I like to give examples and I like to kind of provide context to situations. And so today we will be talking about a racially conscious trauma-informed care. We'll be talking about how do we as psychologists, as providers, bring to our work, our individual work, how do we bring to our work in our agencies, how do we bring to our community a lens of being just racially conscious and trauma-informed. And I guess, you know, I'd like to just share this story. I'll try to keep it brief, but when I was a graduate student years ago, actually, I'll age myself a little bit here, but like 20 something, just over 20 years ago, I sat in my diversity class in my doctoral program. And at the time, it was the only required class for diversity. And it was actually the only class that dealt with racial and ethnic diversity. And the question came up in the class, the conversation came up about whether or not the final paper should be, the final paper that was required on the syllabus should still be required because a number of students in the class were about to go on internship. they were exhausted from the interview process and the application process, and they just didn't have the energy to do the paper. And so this was brought up as a discussion item, and a discussion proceeded around whether or not we should write a paper on diversity. And so I found myself the only, at the time, the only person of color in my program. I remember feeling my skin get hot, and that was a familiar feeling I had when I knew I was the only person in the room who had something to say about a situation that was not going to be the popular perspective in the space, in the name of being culturally responsive. That hot feeling in my face, that racing heart, was also the disbelief that we were having a conversation, and that here I was again, the only person that felt it was important to consider our work as psychologists with marginalized perspective. I sat and I listened as many of my colleagues shared that this was not a good use of their time because they were returning to a community where they didn't service people of color, and they didn't feel that this was a good use of their time. And so I eventually raised my hand and I said, you know, with all due respect, I'm having a hard time with this conversation. And the reason why is because as a Latina, if I want to get a psychologist, I will 99% be certain that I am not going to be faced with someone of my cultural background or who understands my background. And every paper that I write is reaching across a culture that's different from mine for every class that I'm in. And so I hope that, you know, as psychologists, I hope that when I sit in front of a psychologist who's not of my background, they were willing to write a paper about a community that was not like them. And that was a really hard thing to do because I wanted to share my thoughts in a respectful way and also just advocate. I was left exhausted from that. That was a very typical feeling, and it's a typical feeling I have now too. Though that was 20 years ago. I was exhausted. I had a couple of my peers come up to me and say, I'm so glad you're in this class. Every time you speak, I learned something that I wouldn't have considered. And so, I mean, it's good, right? I shared a point of education. I may have shaved a few minutes off of my life because #cortisol, you know, like every time you have an interaction like this, your cortisol is driven up. And I share this story not only for a couple of reasons, not because I want to blame, I mean, there's a larger system here at play that we're all in, and we all need to work together. And so I'll talk about the history in psychology of this foundation, really, where communities are not all given the same importance. And so we'll talk about that. But the reason I bring this up is because though that was 20 years ago, I feel that we're not in a very much different place. These things are still happening in different arenas of our work as psychologists, whether it's in workplaces or in our educational, academic settings, or just, you know, in our, and just in general, in all of in research realms. And so I just bring that up for that example to say that though it was 20 years ago, we're still grappling with the same issues. And just to kind of give the example of, even though that is not really in the scheme of offenses that happens, it's not the worst thing that could happen, but you know, when you're constantly being put in that place as a person of color, where the importance of your community or your scholarship is questioned, it is harmful. It's harmful physically, it creates stress, and it's just important that we understand that. So I share that story, a little bit anxious to do that, but I just like to give real examples situations in this space that we're working in. And so I'm going to share I'm assuming that I have screen share capacity. So I'm going to do that and continue through our work today. And okay, I'm hoping everyone can see. Okay, so I do like to just give a very brief kind of, I'm going to hide these floating panels so you guys can see me. A really brief overview, and we do have limited time today. So I'm gonna just try to give you a feel for the direction that I'm going. So I'll go over some ground rules, though we're not, because this is a keynote, we won't really be doing it in a workshop style where we would break out into rooms and have exercises to walk through. So I'm really just going to present, but I always like to have some ground rules if we have time for questions and answers at the end. And we'll start out with key definitions, just to get us all grounded in the same definitional terms, as well as the areas of grounding for this presentation. And then I want to briefly mention the historical context of mainstream psychology, as well as bring to awareness a call to action paper that was recently published by Division 45, which is the Society for Cultural and Ethnic and Racial Minority Issues within American Psychological Association. And then also recently, the APA resolution on harnessing psychology to combat racism that was passed by council just February 2021. So I want to bring those documents to your radar and talk about some of the recommendations being made in these documents. And the reason for doing that is that actually much of the content around considerations for providers for racially conscious trauma-informed healing approaches is embedded in these documents. And that wasn't actually my original intention with this keynote, but as everyone knows, things have been changing so rapidly in our societal space. And when these documents came out, I felt, especially as the APA Council representative, I felt a real urgency to present in this space on these documents, and to really, I felt like they were a good springboard for discussing some of the considerations for providers. And so folks who know me know, again, that I'm not always the most linear in my approach. I might tell a couple of examples here and there as I go through discussing these documents, but I do, at the end of the presentation, hope to provide you with some individual, organizational level and community level recommendations to consider in this space of racially conscious trauma-informed healing. And the role of advocacy is actually threaded through all of this content. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that rather than discuss it necessarily as a separate item, you'll see that in engaging in this work and from these approaches, advocacy is embedded in the space of this work. I also want to take an opportunity right now to mention something really important for those of you that are registered tomorrow, Saturday. There is a keynote tomorrow morning, and just like today, in between the keynote and the breakouts, today I believe there's yoga, if I'm remembering correctly, but tomorrow there's a very special performance. We have an actor, Ramona Lisa Alexander, who I had the pleasure of seeing her perform right before COVID in a play through the Portland Playhouse called Pipeline. And she will be presenting a monologue right at 10:40 tomorrow that really, from an August Wilson play. And she is really going to be bringing to life, kind of a vignette circumstance around a systemic related issue experienced in the Black community. And so she'll present a monologue and I'm going to introduce her and then moderate a short Q&A. And so it's from 10:40 to 11 tomorrow. And I hope that if you're going to that tomorrow, that some of the ideas that we discussed today will be applicable to thinking through perhaps some of the Q&A items in that presentation. So I invite everyone here to participate in that lovely opportunity where we will really bring together the intersection of art and psychology, of performance and psychology, and be able to learn from that. So we're not going to be having a workshop type of environment where we talk about, we go into spaces and really unpack things, because we just won't have time and it's not the nature of this presentation. But I do often, it's in the packet handout that was circulated through OPA with workshop materials, but I always put out a page of ground rules. In the event we have time for Q&A, and it's just, you know, ground rules for difficult dialogues or any dialogue really when you're in a group space, around just really the goal being to gain a deeper understanding and to be present and active listening, and in the virtual space to state your name prior to speaking. And so these are for you in your packet if you want to refer to them. And if nothing else, I thought for folks who continue these kinds of dialogues in their agency settings, it's a springboard to work from, to have kind of ground rules to reference or modify or adapt as you continue this work in your communities and in your agencies. And I just always put this reminder about microaggressions in my ground rule page, because I find that oftentimes microaggressions, which are unintentional, have different levels, but sometimes I find that they come out in verbal context and conversation. And so I always just put a reminder of what they are and just to be mindful of them. So again, we won't be really probably, you know, having to go to that per se today, but I just wanted people to have them anyway, because I think it's really important as we continue this work with our groups and our organizations. And so I wanted to mention that I want to first start with definitions. And as I mentioned earlier, these are just around grounding us in the same kind of language as we talk about the documents that I mentioned. So again, because this is about racially conscious trauma-informed care, I just wanted to get us on the same page with some of these terms. So just really, you know, first just thinking about trauma, and just a reminder, because I know trauma is often like a specialty, and it's just a reminder to kind of think about kind of the definition out there, which is that there's no universal definition. SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has this definition for trauma, which is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And just a reminder, the experience of trauma is subjective. It's individually based upon the person's perception. So what is perceived as traumatic to one person might not necessarily be traumatic or as impactful in the trauma space to another person, which is part of why it's hard to define trauma in a universal way. And also just the understanding that, you know, a lot of folks are familiar with adverse childhood experiences. And so there's also that cumulative impact of trauma experienced early it being harder then to, you know, kind of cope and manage after a trauma experience later in life. So there's also, you know, information about timing of trauma and cumulative trauma. And so regardless, the impact of an adverse event, especially in childhood, can be far-reaching and have been associated with compromised health later in life. And, you know, that example I gave you early on, just even the physiological response to being in a situation where you feel, you know, not heard or whatever it is, that's, you know, just, you know, there's a lot now of research or an emerging body of research suggesting with those racialized experiences and discriminatory experience on an ongoing level that keeps your cortisol high does have health impact. And that's why we have racial and ethnic health disparities, and those relate also to the impact of COVID and the disparity in COVID impact. And so, you know, again, just keeping those things in mind. So I want to talk about historical trauma. So there are different types of trauma: intergenerational, historical, racial, and, you know, like, it's really important to just kind of understand the different types of trauma. And so with historical trauma, this actually refers to experiences such as, for example, genocide, slavery, forced relocation, and destruction of cultural practices that are shared by communities and result in cumulative emotional and psychological wounds that get carried across generations. In the packet handout that I provided, there is one page that has a few suggested videos. I believe there is at least one, but I think 2 and possibly 3 on historical trauma. They're really brief, maybe 6 to 7 minutes each. They are excellent in really kind of describing a little more in depth about these kinds of traumas. And so I would highly recommend, if you have a chance, if you haven't watched them in the past, to watch them, just to kind of really have a better sense of historical trauma. But essentially, you know, I just really want to emphasize with historical trauma that the effects of traumas that are inflicted on groups of people because of their race, creed, ethnicity, linger on the souls of their descendants. So many people in these same communities experience higher rates, as I was talking about earlier, mental and physical illness, substance abuse, and erosion in families and community structures. And the persistent cycle of trauma can destroy family and communities and threaten the vibrancy of entire cultures. And so just a reminder that historical trauma is not just about what happened in the past, it's about what's still happening. It can be intergenerational, and it's really played out in our systemic racism circumstance. Okay, I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. I kind of have a set timeline. So racial trauma or race-based stress refers to events of danger related to real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination. So these can include threats of harm, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing harm to other ethnic and racial minorities due to real or perceived racism. And this type of trauma stems from a legacy of oppressive laws and policies and practices. And so I'm just kind of giving you key terms, just even as a refresher, or just to kind of get on the same page of like how I'm discussing it when I talk throughout the presentation. So intersectionality, folks may have heard this term that Crenshaw kind of really elaborated on in the 90s, but it pertains to an overlap of social group categories that include but are not limited to race, gender, and social class as it relates to systems of oppression. So really just that understanding that people may not necessarily belong to a single underrepresented or oppressed group. And just also acknowledging that intersectional oppression, so such as racial, gender, sexual orientation, and xenophobic microaggressions can actually contribute to that cumulative impact of racial trauma. And that actually leaves scars on those that are dehumanized by racism and ethno-violence. And so it's really important that in any thinking, and I'll talk more about this later, in our work with, with just considering a racially conscious approach, we need to think about intersectionality. We need to think about the fact that that is, there are often multiple intersections because also systemic racism, is not, the idea is that multiple, because racism was constructed historically for such a long time in our history, and all these other systems developed alongside of it. So all of our systems have this foundation. So I talked about trauma, and I just, for the purposes of our conversation, I really focused on historical and racial trauma, but now I want to just distinguish what a trauma-informed approach is. And again, I just kind of go to that SAMHSA definition, and it's really, they just really kind of focus, and for those of you that are kind of trying to take an organizational, trying to also bring things back to your practice or your organization, it's a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed, actually realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, family, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist traumatization. And so the six, I just kind of put the 6 key, if you can't remember all of that, just the 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so, by the way, I do have a glossary in my packet just of key terms for your reference. So in the packet that I provided, there is a glossary, so you can have that reference. So then what is a racially conscious trauma-informed approach? If that is what a trauma-informed approach is, it's actually, it acknowledges and treats race-based stress and discrimination as trauma. So the healing of ethno-racial trauma or racial trauma requires a focus on both the symptoms of the trauma, the internal symptoms of the trauma, and also recognizes the interlocking systems of oppression that are external and that cause and maintain psychological distress. So it's really about, again, there's also that acknowledgement piece that I talked about in the very beginning, acknowledging that there's a level of the trauma that's coming from these interlocking systems of oppression that are real. And so that is part of having that racially conscious lens, is that acknowledgement at the same time that you're treating the internal symptoms. And so to have this approach, it requires a combination of treatment models and interventions that are designed to address trauma. So again, that trauma-informed perspective that some here may be very familiar with, and along with that, having a real good grounding in the literature on systemic oppression, such as liberation psychology. And I'll mention a little later, maybe some of the frameworks that you can explore if you're interested in having a deeper foundation on like oppression approaches that really consider the oppression model. But this type of combination of trauma-informed care with that systemic recognition, the systemic oppression recognition, is really a viable integrative framework that can promote healing to those who have experienced ethno-racial trauma. Because again, I'm just going back to that first tool of acknowledgement and recognition of the systemic piece is so important in the healing. And then this probably kind of belonged in the historical, on the historical side, but I always like to kind of remind everyone that current lifespan trauma that's superimposed upon a traumatic ancestral past creates additional adversity. A couple of other key definitions, because they'll come back in the Division 45 paper that I present, are the terms colonial and decolonize. And so colonial refers to the pervasive societal and political policies that seek to retain authority over marginalized communities and exploit the earth for its natural resources by way of oppressively imposing dominant cultural practices. And that's referenced in the glossary, and it comes from this APA Division 45 Warriors Path paper, which I'll go into shortly. And decolonize refers to a series of actions that question and disrupt systems that promote inequity and oppression. So really, when we think about decolonizing our systems, we think about decolonizing psychology. It's about questioning and disrupting systems that continue to promote inequity and oppression. And so that's really important to keep in mind here with the lens that we're discussing today. I just have to make a note about implicit bias. It's a term that we hear a lot. Just a reminder, I'll talk about it later when we talk about approach or things you can do, but it's a reminder that this is unconscious, it's unintentional bias against others based on their race, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation, etc. Just biases that we have that are almost automatic because we learned them, you know, early on. They're shaped by our social conditioning from a very early age, and they can affect our relationships and our interactions with others in all areas, professional, personal. They just can impact our relationships, and we all have them. We all have them every day. It doesn't matter who we are. And the work is to be aware of them, to try, and when you find that you operated in a space of bias, to unpack it for yourself and to try to understand that a little more and to be mindful of it. It's really, you know, I guess I really, I'm really bringing this up to kind of talk about, let's really think about where our ideas come from and where has our profession, you know, where do we see these things in our own, systemically and in our own behaviors, and how can we create change, and how can we promote change? And so it's really just about your willingness to engage. I mean, yes, so I guess I just share that because no one is immune to this, and it doesn't matter how racially conscious and trauma informed you are, we have these and we're dealing with them all the time. And so I know this is a lot, so I thank you for bearing with me. There's so much that I want to share, so I'm glad this is recorded. So like if people want to go back to it, because yeah, there's a lot. And so I'm just going to keep talking. I'm hoping that the information is useful. I want to just remind us, or just ground us, you know, in the trauma-informed lens. And what I want to say beyond the definitions about being trauma-informed is that being, you know, trauma-informed care, it's actually not just for after a trauma has occurred. It is recommended in all interactions. We just really have to kind of think that, you know, especially in our BIPOC work and also considering intersectionality, that it's just really important to have this lens and to carry that lens with you in your work, period. And it's important also to differentiate between levels of trauma, whether it be historical, intergenerational, racial, specific trauma. It's just essential that we not only perceive through the lens of trauma and understand trauma, but we also need to understand the variation in expression of trauma and how it can show up for people. And another area of grounding that I wanted to share that's actually really important to this framework is resilience, but not what we've come to think of as resilience as bouncing back, you know, which is typically like bouncing back from a hard thing. But really, I wanted to redefine it from a BIPOC lens and share some more recent ideas on that redefinition for BIPOC folks. So just, you know, important to understand that people of color are resilient in the face of race-based stress, and that they've developed coping strategies across generations to heal from trauma. So just the way we think about traumatic stress crossing generations, so can resilience, and that people of color have continuously shown resilience in the face of racial trauma through their cultural identity and familial bonds and community bonds. And that type of involvement can increase the protective factors that people experience around the negative outcomes to racial traumatic stress, and also serve as a way to feel empowered. But the big thing I want to talk about is, like I said before, it's typically resilience. We use that word a lot in our mainstream language. It's referred as one's ability to cope and to overcome hardships. But it's a really complex and a multi-layered process. And for BIPOC people, it may look a little different because of the generations of trauma and systemic racism and cultural barriers. So some people have no choice but to be resilient, but it's also important to consider that, for instance, from a radical healing perspective, resilience moves beyond that coping, but it's also thought of as BIPOC's commitment to living joy-filled lives despite a critical awareness of racial trauma and oppression. So it's this idea that there is an ability to experience moments of joy, moments of connection and happiness, while also acknowledging that oppression is part of your life and your existence. And so it's just really important to kind of, you know, reframe that. And it also is a more strength-based reframing. And so I just wanted to ground us in that as we go into a little bit of the historical context. And I just want to let people know I can only see my slideshow, so I can't see anyone in the gallery. So that's another reason for having questions at the end. So I appreciate your understanding with that. So the historical context of mainstream psychology. I'm not going to go into the whole history. That's like another presentation, more of a deeper level training. But what I will say is that the history of the construction of racism is extensive. I mean, we're thinking about 1600s, you know, the construction of racism developing, you know, starting with, you know, wondering if, you know, indigenous and Black people were humans, and, you know, that dehumanization piece, which is rooted, you know, centuries and centuries ago. So it's extensive history, and it crosses lines of religion and medicine and philosophy and science and government, and it includes psychology. Our profession needs to reorganize around you know, undoing this history and how it shows up in our profession, in our history of psychology. And so essentially, and that's not just psychology, like I said, it crosses all lines, essentially because we live in a society where systemic racism is alive and well, and it's actually the foundation of the United States. The profession of psychology is part of this. it too is founded on racist beliefs and practices. And so that's sometimes like a wow, like I think it can be hard to consider it that way, but it needs to kind of be thought of in this way because that's the work that has to be done. And so I also say this because it's about, you know, it really is about a system. And so the system of psychology, if you will, and the work that we're engaged in. And you can say this about many, many systems. So with that in mind, I want to just kind of remind us of the definition for institutional racism, which is often used interchangeably with systemic or structural racism. But I really like this definition from Dismantling Racism, but essentially it has to do with the ways that structures and systems and policies and procedures of institutions in the United States are founded upon and then continue to promote and reproduce and perpetuate advantages for white people and the oppression of people of color. And it's the ways in which institutions legislate and structure reality to advantage white people and oppress people of color. And so it's the ways in which institutions, all of these institutions and more, perpetuate racism. What I want to say about this definition in particular, where we talk about the institutions legislating and structuring reality, you know, that's a form of power. When we can create reality for people by labeling diagnostically, by using, you know, instruments to inform those diagnoses that are not normed on the community a person is from, but we can then say, but this is what is going on with you, or we can create systems where the reality of, you know, the pipeline from school to prison is highly, highly likely. You know, like the reality of a shorter lifespan is highly, highly likely because of the ways in which institutions and structures are set up. Like when we have that power to impact reality, that is part of that systemic racism. I just want to acknowledge that I feel like when I do these talks, it does not feel very strength-based because I am giving history and I'm talking about painful stuff, but I really do want to, you know, just really inform ultimately how we can engage in these processes and approaches so that it is about recognizing the strengths in the community and in the communities that we're serving, and to utilize an approach that's grounded in strength and celebrating those strengths. So so yeah, I just want to acknowledge that this can be hard to hear and hard to speak about over and over again, but that I really feel hopeful for the directions that we are recognizing we need to move in. And so that's what this is about, is holding that hope and moving forward. And so I would like to now talk about, as was noted in my introduction, and as some folks may know just from being on the OPA list, I am the current council representative to the American Psychological Association representing Oregon. And in this past council session in February of 2021, APA Council passed the APA resolution on harnessing psychology to combat racism. This resolution adopts a uniform definition and understanding, and also puts forth what APA resolves to do in this space of harnessing psychology to combat racism. So I just wanted to identify some things that the resolution does. It defines racism and related terms, and it provides a historical context and current context of racism and psychology. It talks about systemic racism. It grounds in intersectionality and the importance of that. It highlights the harm caused by racism and the approach needed to overcome it. It talks about how the field of psychology has contributed to racism and racial bias through foundation in eugenics and other harmful perspectives. It also talks about the fact that historically the narrow focus of psychology, by really being focused at the more individual level, limited the ability to eradicate racism because it did not incorporate a systemic lens, which is something I just mentioned as an approach that's important, is really acknowledging the role of systemic oppression in healing. This resolution also reaffirms the denunciation of racism in all forms in our profession, and it adopts the definition of racism for a common understanding for psychologists. As well, it outlines 4 levels of intersecting forms of racism for psychologists to consider in their work. And these levels are structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized racism. And it talks about the fact that these intersect and that the call is for in all areas that psychologists are engaged in to really understand that these things intersect and they all need to be addressed in the work to combat racism. It promotes comprehensive strategies to address racism operating at multiple levels. So that's in the space of education, in the space of research, in the space of our clinical practices. It calls to strengthen anti-racism practices and policies, to call for active dismantling of other systems of oppression that interact with racism. So it calls to kind of work together with other systems like criminal justice, education, to dismantle racism. And there's an acknowledgement of the need to continue to advocate for culturally informed services and research to promote resilience in communities of color. It asks psychologists to eliminate processes and procedures that perpetuate racial injustice in research, practice, education, and training, and also to continue to develop anti-racism policies and specific resolutions on how psychology can help to mitigate and eradicate racism. That's a lot. It's a lot and it's amazing. And APA is actively engaged in really centering the organization around an EDI focus. So they're like restructuring so that rather than having all of these areas and boards and committees that have, you know, diversity here, diversity there, EDI in certain places, that EDI is the core and everything is centered around EDI. So there is now a call in our profession to, you know, do this dismantling work. And it's hard and it will take time. It's hard because it's learned and it's embedded and it's systemic. And so for folks that are familiar with resolution language, usually there's a bunch of whereas statements that are like, whereas this is almost like definitional statements, and then therefore we will do this. And so I just am going to share some of the direct quotes from the resolution, just so that you, and also I think that you can Google this. I don't know if it made it onto my reference list. I can always share it later to Jeff, and can share it to you as well if you cannot find it, but you should be able to find it too. But I thought I would share some direct quotes just so you can have a feel for really the impact of this work, and that this is the direction that our field is going. And this, like I said, was just passed in February of 2021. So one of the whereas statements, whereas positionality refers to one's position or place in relation to race, ethnicity, and other statuses, and how our identities relate to the systems of privilege and oppression that shape our psychological experiences, relationships, and access to resources. I want to pause for a moment here to mention positionality as a practice. Actually, I'll mention it again later, but this is super important because I think as psychologists, we need to be in an active process of considering our positionality. One way that I think is important to do this, that actually we had an equity, diversity, and inclusion trainer at one of the council meetings who talked about interpretive power, but first did this exercise where we had a grid, and I've kind of elaborated on this in some of my workshops, so some folks may know about this, where you kind of look at your identities. You list a bunch of different identities, you know, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and just, you can list all the spaces of identity. And then you can note for yourself if you are in a marginalized or privileged space with that identity. And I kind of take it to another level where I say, okay, look at your identity, look at all of the identities that you can think of. And where do you land? Are you in a privileged space? Are you in a minoritized, marginalized space? Now, which identities do you have experience with? So some identities say poverty. If you were born into poverty but are no longer experiencing poverty, that's an identity that, though you are privileged now, you can maybe have, you relate very well to the marginalized experience of that. And so really examining, where have you moved in identities, and what identities do you not have the ability to move, and where are you marginalized but privileged in that marginalization? So this is really deep work. It's really important to understand where you stand. And so my examples of that are, I am Latina, but I have skin color privilege compared to my Afro-Latinx family members and colleagues, and my Black colleagues, and any Black family members and friends that I have skin color privilege. So even though I may have other intersection marginalized identities, my skin color offers me privilege as a woman of color, because I am a lighter skinned woman of color. And so I also talk about the fact that some may know in this space, some don't, that I am completely deaf in my right ear. I hear nothing in my right ear, and I haven't. I was either born that way or it happened very early in my life. But it's an invisible disability. So even though it does impact me, it's invisible. And so I have the privilege of hiding that. And so I actually did not even identify as, I tried to compensate. And in general, I've compensated to some degree, but I tend to compensate because it's hidden, and I didn't want to draw yet another ism when I was combating all kinds of isms around my ethnicity, and being assumed not to be intelligent because my mother had an accent when I was growing up, and all kinds of things that I had to combat already as a woman of color. And I just I didn't ask for support around my partial deafness that I probably would have benefited from, but I just didn't want to draw attention to that. But it was a privilege to be able to hide that. And so that was a privilege. And so I kind of ask people to do that deeper work of looking at their positionality and really understanding it, because you really, you have to be able to do that work and really unpack that to then be able to connect and work with your clients in a trauma-informed way and a racially conscious trauma-informed way. So I really like that this resolution highlights the importance of positionality in this work. And so another whereas statement, these are just things that it's all very powerful. So it was hard to kind of choose segments, but another whereas statement from the resolution, whereas to overcome and eliminate the pervasive harms of racism, it is essential to directly confront oppression using a culturally centered and strength-based approach to achieve psychological liberation, promote empowerment, and influence social reality through cultural and humanistic change. And I think that, you know, really what I like about this is really focusing on that culturally centered and strength-based approach, which is so important in this work. And then another whereas statement, whereas the field of psychology has historically contributed to the belief in human hierarchy through allowing or not challenging racial bias throughout the discipline and profession, such as in peer review, publishing, research motivated by racism, racial disparities in psychological research, and the valuation of certain types of research, as well as in Eurocentric models of clinical practice, including psychological assessment, while largely ignoring the contributions of and adversities facing BIPOC. An example I can give about this is that in my years as a principal investigator at Portland State, I worked with various reservation as well as urban native serving organizations. And one community that I worked with, we were already implementing a culturally specific program and collecting some outcome information. And it was a program designed by the community around, you know, culturally specific approaches. And one of the things that we found was that in mixed race Native kids, their mental health outcomes were not as positive. And there was a concern about that. And, you know, about what was going on for those youth in particular, about maybe not fitting in, et cetera. And so I teamed up with the community and we wrote a grant to NIH and submitted this to specifically look at the mental health outcomes with the mixed race youth. And we really wrote a strong proposal. And, you know, there were 3 reviewers. 2 of the reviewers were just, you know, very strong with the review, supporting, but one reviewer said, well, this is not generalizable. This is not important. Essentially, this does not have it's not going to impact enough people, which is actually not true. But when you don't have reviewers that are really knowledgeable about the community that, you know, you are trying to impact, then you have something like that. And that prevented the community from being able to do this deeper work to service that specific group of kids. And so that's an example of, you know, not valuing certain types of research and a certain type of community. So I'm going to move into a couple of examples of the therefore statements with the resolution, because this is about the solution. And this one in particular is the definition of racism that APA has put forth for psychologists. So I thought it would be useful for everyone to have this. Therefore, be it resolved that APA adopts the following definition of racism as an ideology to establish a common understanding for psychologists and other disciplines to inform and guide efforts to examine and eradicate racism. So here's your definition, psychologists. Racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on phenotypic properties, skin color and hair texture associated with race in the US. This system, which ranges from daily interpersonal interactions shaped by race to racialized opportunities for good education, housing, employment, unfairly disadvantages people belonging to marginalized racial groups and damages their health and mental health. Unfairly advantages individuals belonging to socially and politically dominant racial groups and ultimately undermines the full potential of the whole society. So that's the APA definition in the resolution that was just passed. So I wanted to share that with everyone so that you just kind of have that as a place of understanding. And so again, therefore, I mentioned this earlier in the shorter bullets, but another therefore statement, therefore be it resolved that psychologists should consider the following 4 levels of racism in designing and implementing anti-racist research, education, training, policy, and clinical applications through the lens of intersectionality. So again, just understanding that structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized racism are intersecting, and these are 4 different levels that intersect, but that also need to be each acknowledged. And so I think this might be the last therefore statement. Therefore, be it further resolved that APA will call upon all psychologists to eliminate processes and procedures that perpetuate racial injustice in research, practice, education, and training, speak out against racism, take proactive steps to prevent the occurrence of intolerant or racist acts, and promote effective strategies based on psychological research to alleviate racial injustice. So I really wanted to share these whereas and therefore be it further resolved statements, because it's just really important to know this is where we're at. This is where APA is at in terms of restructuring and dismantling, and it may feel overwhelming because it's a big system, but you know, it's just also good to know that there will be information forthcoming and suggestions starting with even today, even within these statements, there are ideas that you can take with you, which I'll talk about a little more. And so the other thing I wanted to mention, which kind of almost simultaneously has been put out, is the Division 45 presidential, so each division has like a president, and Division 45 presidential task force. Again, Division 45 within APA, if you're not familiar or you're not a member of APA, it really is the one that's focused on culture, you know, the Society for the Study of Culture and Race and Ethnicity. And the president in 2019, Dr. Joseph Gone, he put out a charge for a task force called the Warriors Path. And it was the Warriors Path Presidential Task Force. And the charge was what courses of action would enable Division 45 to serve more effectively and efficiently as psychological warriors in defense of our people inside and outside of psychology. And as part of the charge, areas that were recommended to consider and examined included honoring the initiatives of elders, recovering and respecting and protecting the cultural history of Division 45. So one thing to do as a side note for organizations, those of you that are really interested in bringing this work and how to think about this work in an organizational space, is to really consider the history and just go back and, you know, if, you know, look at the history of your organization, the history around the, you know, original sort of mission, has that changed, and how the work has been approached in these spaces, if at all, and just, you know, it's really good to understand your historical foundations as you continue to evolve and make changes. And then also another area examined was to identify barriers within APA preventing efficient and effective use of its political influence to care for and protect our people in a timely fashion. So this has to do also, for those of you that are interested in organizational level impact, barriers that exist in bylaws and rules, and organizational barriers to diversity, whether it's, you know, hiring practices or whatever it may be, and barriers to transformative truth and reconciliation processes that would foster healing. And so really thinking about those barriers, this is what Division 45 was doing, but I'm just kind of expanding it to like consider as you listen to this, how it might be applicable to your agencies and the work you're doing. And also just the other area they wanted to look at was advocacy for decolonization processes for a psychologically healthier, inclusive, and equitable present and future inside and outside of psychology. And so again, this was kind of the charge and the areas of intention to focus on. And so what came out of the charge, and I'm just kind of briefly going to talk about this, but the paper is referenced in my reference section, and it's the first reference on the reference page of my reference section materials. So I would highly encourage people to read this. It's really powerful and really helpful to read, whether you're a member of Division 45 or APA, because it has to do with the concept of decolonizing, organizational and psychology in different settings, including if you're a faculty at a university, just really good considerations for our work as psychologists. But what came out of this was a call to action for decolonizing and dismantling the Eurocentric structure and practice of APA. And I would argue, again, really tools that can be taken to your organizations. So as that call for action, things that were suggested, healing, which comes from, again, acknowledging and recognizing from APA regarding the harm done to BIPOC students, practitioners, and communities through the perpetuation of colonial practices, through both the history of psychology to our current systems and policies. A committed, sustained action. So what that means is really like highlighting a commitment and really putting action behind it. So that could be anything from a self-study to doing an environmental scan. And with regard to your organizations, thinking more specifically to our groups here, it's also about putting action behind things that you know you're ready for in your agency. Like, what are you ready for, and what do you want to be ready for, and what can you actually put action towards? So if you're not really able to put action toward it, it can be more harmful to say something without putting action toward it. So again, that is what is meant by committed, sustained action. So again, this was Division 45's call to action to APA and within the division as well. Representation. So for example, in decision-making bodies, to have proportionate representation with, quote, enough BIPOC to recalibrate and refresh perspectives of those that have been historically excluded. And then there was a note about accreditation. And so really transforming the culture of APA accredited institutions so that ethnic minority psychologists, leaders are incorporated into the knowing of how diversity should be reflected in accredited programs by the APA, and then consultation. And with NPAs is the Ethnic Minority Psych Associations. So it's talking about consultation with the ethnic minority psych associations, as well as compensating the BIPOC psychologists that are volunteering, really both personally and professionally committed to this work, that are doing a lot of volunteering without compensation. And also in the summary from this Warriors Path Task Force report, there was a call to colleagues, and I really thought that this quote was powerful because it really acknowledges a lot. And so I'll just read the quote. Your wellness, so this is all of us too, your wellness is important to our wellness. It is central to the healing of our discipline. We'd like to create inward-facing support and measures to acknowledge and deal with the trauma we've experienced, and outward-facing recognition for your decolonial and anti-racist efforts and practices to inform and inspire systemic change. As we exact a call for the truth and reconciliation from the larger APA body politic, we must not be trepidatious about calling on ourselves to pursue our own decolonial processes within our spheres of influence. Small steps are meaningful steps. And I would say hold on to that, because I think it can feel overwhelming, but I really want to say that yes, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work that's happening, and to have that hope moving forward. And so one of the things that I really appreciated from this work is that there were examples given for how colleagues can respond to the call. These are just a few examples, and this call was really intended as a starting place, just some suggestions and some ideas for how to move this work forward. And so anything from constructing curricula that reflects decolonial premises and multiculturalism, translation of psychological measurement instruments should not only attend to the quality of translation, of linguistic translation, but also the cultural sensitivity of translation. So for those of you in the testing sphere, which I've also done a lot of work in that space around equity, there are a lot of instruments that are linguistically translated, but the translations are very poor. And so there needs to be that dual attention to the quality of the translation, but also the cultural sensitivity of the translation and meaningfulness of the translation. And then with regard to funding, I gave an example earlier, but really bridging and connecting. So those of you that are in the space of doing research, bridging and connecting with research funding entities in order to provide education to program officers that oversee that funding on decolonial methodologies. So that could include something like community-based participatory research and methodologies that really engage the community voice and perspective. And so that was all the background, but I feel like I touched on some of the key things for tools. And they may seem simple, but they're not. Because in order to become racially conscious trauma informed, at the key work is at the individual level, first and foremost, even if you want to branch out to community and even if you want to branch out to agency. So again, I've said it a few times, but individual level ongoing work is that acknowledgement and recognition of harm done because of systemic racism, which is policies and practices. So that acknowledgement and recognition when you're working with people is so important. And then again, I talked about examining and understanding your positionality. And I just want to remind, we only know what we know. We only know what we know in our bodies of who we are and our experiences, and everything else is an expansion. And so first and foremost, we have to understand that. And so, like rather than, shaming and having all this guilt, it's really important to kind of say, yeah, this is who I am. This is my positionality. And now my work is to really expand and try to understand and know as much as I can without knowing as much, without being able to know what it is actually like to stand in those shoes. But as much as I can, I want to try to expand my understanding. And so providers who are members of the dominant group, or really providers that, whenever you're trying to connect with someone who you're not in that group, but providers who are members of the dominant group, I wanted to just mention that you might not be able to identify with the complex and ambiguous and subtle ways in which racism in particular manifests in the lives of non-dominant group members. So I just want to put that out there because there are a lot of things that are really not so subtle for people of color, but that go unnoticed because it's not your lived experience. And so, but research does suggest that ambiguous and subtle forms of racist acts can have greater negative psychological impact than the more overt forms of racial acts. And so I just want to put that reminder out there about why positionality is so important, because I think the more that you do that work in that space and you engage in that as a regular practice, the more likely you are to minimize that impact. And so also I wanted to mention, ongoing self-work to understand and reflect upon your own implicit biases. So I showed that slide earlier with implicit biases and defining it. and really just that reminder that we all have them, and we all find ourselves in a place where we're like, oh, wow, okay, I had a bias there. And so this includes then stepping back and learning from your mistakes when you engage with your implicit biases. And so self-reflection is important to your comfort, ultimately, in discussing race and race-based trauma with clients and with colleagues, and especially around validating racism's impact on a client. So just that reminder that implicit bias, self-reflecting, getting comfortable with that and understanding that everyone has them, and the more comfortable you are with like really unpacking that, you know, the more responsive you are going to be with this work. And just a reminder, I mentioned this before, that in treatment, we want to focus on both the symptoms of the trauma that are internal and the interlocking systems of oppression that are external that can maintain and that cause and maintain that psychological distress. And again, a reminder around the BIPOC resilience and strength-based incorporation, so that, you know, understanding as a provider about living joy-filled lives despite awareness of reality of racial trauma and oppression. And this was in the APA resolution and the warrior path, if you read it in full too, but I just wanna really emphasize the intersectional stance all the time. So, and that's really kind of what our, you know, our field is emphasizing as well. So I just have this slide around the intersectional stance, supporting our attitude as therapists. So it supports the therapist's attitude and characteristics in a manner consistent with what we actually know about successful therapeutic relationships from a research standpoint. So it's a good thing to do, period. And then this stance really, you know, again, appreciates the impact of intersectional oppression and how that impacts BIPOC people's lives and distress. So distress, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm messing up my words here, but the distress experienced by BIPOC folks. And so again, just having this stance allows your clients to explore, it gives permission, explore the difficulties and challenges and assumptions of these sources, and really takes away that self-blame. And so earlier I mentioned the piece of the APA resolution that talks about internalized racism. And so it really does allow the client to not, to have self-compassion and take away that self-blame for experiencing symptoms that are really a reaction to oppressive environments. It also can depathologize many of the struggles that oppressed communities experience, and it opens up dialogue that is more authentic and allows for accounting for those realities in the therapeutic process. Because we don't have a lot of time left, I'm just going to give mention, if you're interested in continuing this work in your agency or as a provider, if you're in private practice and you want to kind of explore some of these approaches for bringing this racially conscious lens into your work, there are a few models that are out there that I'd like to suggest, and you can probably do your own research and find more as well. But there's radical healing, which in this particular approach, clients can address the pain of their identity-based trauma by actively resisting the oppression they face and cultivating a sense of hope that there is the ability to have justice. And so that sense of hope, as we know, as providers, is super important in the work we do with everyone. And so this sense of hope is specific to justice around racial trauma. And then there's also liberation psychology, which is probably folded into the radical healing, but you can specifically do more reading around liberation psychology, which encourages those that experience oppression to view their struggles through a more collectivist lens, which is also more culturally responsive. And it also requires that cultural or collective social action. So the understanding from this perspective of liberation psychology is that healing takes place when you gain awareness of the systemic roots of their challenges, and you also learn strategies that allow you to act in ways to resist oppression that lead to social change. So it's kind of also just a tool for advocacy, which again is kind of threaded through all of this work. And then I also like to talk about relational cultural theory, which is a theory that really kind of started in the 80s. It's a feminist theoretical and practice approach. But what I like about it, and it's kind of held strong into today, but what I like about it is that culture acts as a premier component of relationship. And it also kind of differs from traditional psychodynamic theory because it's rooted in feminist theory and social justice and focuses on relationship as a central development concept. And actually, if you go deeper into relational cultural theory, you can also, if you're not familiar with it, that is, there are just like specific kind of mechanisms within the theory around mutuality, and you can evolve it to a supervision lens as well, and even kind of cross-cultural supervision. So I think it has like a lot of applications for this work. And so I just kind of gently mention this because it's a model that I like to talk about, particularly in the space of supervision. And so I also just wanted to make a few additional comments for organizational level, folks that own kind of larger group practices or are part of an agency and trying to evolve the agency work. There's a lot of overlap here with the individual work, but really considering things like a self-study. I mentioned kind of like doing a history, kind of like a look back into the history and where what the historical roots of your agency are. But that could be part of a self-study, and also doing it, maybe considering a needs assessment around areas for growth in the EDI space, committing to anti-racist practices. Again, anti-racist practices that you can commit to, maybe having, this is what we can do now, this is what we're going to work toward. Having representation, making sure things like, your hiring practices are really bringing in a diverse pool of applicants and making sure that your teams are diverse and able to serve the community. And this obviously intersects with the real pipeline issue that is also being addressed in APA with just not enough psychologists, to do the work in communities of color, and not enough, representation in our field because of these systemic issues. And so, but really, how, thinking about how as an agency, what can you do something about, and how can you bring representation, and really considering like that space. And obviously there's like ongoing training to support skill development of racially conscious trauma-informed care. And I would add to that, there's training and there's preparation. So I think you can do lots of training, but you also want to do the work of preparation. So, that also comes with that deeper level kind of commitment and dialogues. So again, those ground rules that are in the packet that you can evolve to, how you need to evolve them to have difficult dialogues in your agency. But I think that it's just really important not only to have the training, but to have the preparedness and to develop anti-racist policies that are informed by your self-study, informed by consultation, and community input from the community you're serving. And, again, in the individual space, there's an intersection with advocacy because you're pushing for equity, and the same holds true at the organizational level. How can you partner with other organizations that are providing related services, or you know, how can you provide advocacy and work together? And then community-based, community level. This does not do justice to the community level, but a few ideas to kind of incorporate community. Again, advocacy, well, that's the last one, but I guess I'll start there because I was just talking about it. Again, that intersection with advocacy, working with other systems, again, to eradicate racism. So perhaps if your agency does a lot of work in with child welfare, really kind of coming together with child welfare and finding ways to address this work together and address the intersection with that agency and the systemic policies that can be harmful to those you serve. I mentioned earlier community-based participatory research. That was the type of research I engaged with for years, and it really involves being in partnership with communities, and communities being experts around what they are wanting to address in their community, and you're really a colleague and not an expert, but in a partnership and working together with community-driven initiatives. And so that's an advocacy research model and also a decolonizing model. Having advisory committees and made up of community folks that can really guide and kind of keep you in check. And also, like I mentioned before, with the agency level, also partnering with at the community level with agencies and finding out how you can have presence and be supportive. And I don't know, let me see if we have time for this. I'm gonna try to have time for this. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, there's this book, Burnout. It's about the secret to unlocking the stress cycle. It is written by these two women, Emily and Amelia Nagoski. I think I have it in the reference list. It actually has some great tools for like immediate processing of stress in your body. And so I think it's a great tool for actually doing clinical work. There could be some really good ideas in here about how to process through stressful moments and just tools for clients. So in that regard, I would recommend it. But there's a lot of just kind of really nice descriptions in here. And so I wanted to read a segment, if you'll bear with me, from this book and kind of close with that. So this is called the Tall Tree Fairness Test. And this is what is written in the book. And I just thought it was an interesting place to circle back to. We can imagine the advantages and disadvantages that shape our lives as similar to the natural environment that shapes a tree as it grows. A tree growing on an open level field grows straight and tall toward the sun. A tree that grows on a hillside will also grow toward the sun, which means it will grow at an angle. The steeper the hill, the sharper the angle of the tree. So if we transplant the tree to the level field, it's going to be a totally different shape from a tree native to that field. Both are adapted to the environment where they grew. We can infer the shape of the environment where a tree grew by looking at the shape of the tree. White men grow on an open level field. White women grow on far steeper and rougher terrain because the field wasn't made for them. Women of color grow not just on a hill, but on a cliffside over the ocean, battered by wind and waves. None of us chooses the landscape in which we're planted. If you find yourself on an ocean-battered cliff, your only choice is to grow there or fall into the ocean. So if we transplant a survivor of the steep hill and cliff to the level field, natives of the field may look at that survivor and wonder why she has so much trouble trusting people, systems, and even her own bodily sensations. Why is this tree so bent and gnarled? It is because that is what it took to survive in the place where she grew. A tree that's fought wind and gravity and erosion to grow strong and green on a steep cliff is going to look strange and out of place when moved to the level playing field. The gnarled windblown tree from an oceanside cliff might not conform with our ideas of what a tree should look like, but it works well in the context where it grew. And that tall, straight tree wouldn't stand a chance if it was transplanted to the cliffside. Instead of wondering, I'm skipping here, instead of wondering why they aren't thriving on the level playing field, imagine how the field can be changed to allow everyone to thrive. And I just wanted to add that when I was a trainee, I asked for a recommendation from a professor, and the professor said, gladly, I will write this recommendation. And you know how you're not supposed to have a copy of your recommendation. So of course I didn't ask for one, because that just wasn't what you did. But this professor came back to me and said, I know I'm not supposed to give you a copy, but I really want you to have this because, I feel so strongly about you as a student. And so here's the letter. And so I was like, oh, okay, thank you. And I opened up the letter and I read the first sentence, when I was alone, but the first sentence of the letter said, Eleanor is one of the best students in our program, irrespective of her minority status. And so I'm gonna rewrite that and just say Eleanor was one of the best students in her program. And that's my way of decolonizing that for myself. And I hope that students of color after me don't have to decolonize it for themselves, but that our field will just be in that space of decolonization. Thank you.